important parameters in music. We wouldn't have music as we know it without the parameter of melody. So when we're talking about melody, we're really measuring pitches, and pitch measures a sound's highness or lowness. So you might have heard of middle C before, which is in the middle of the piano, and then you can find the same C either octaves above it or below it, which sounds higher or lower, like this. Alright, so here's middle C, same pitch an octave higher, and then that same pitch, but an octave lower. And we can go all up and down the piano the same way until we get to very high pitches, or very low ones. So pitch measures the highness or the lowness of the sound. Next we can talk about range. When we talk about range, we're measuring the distance from the highest note in a particular context to the lowest note. Now that may be in the entire piece, but usually that's pretty wide. So you might instead measure something like the range of a particular vocalist or melody. So if you took a melody, you can measure the highest point to the lowest point and say how wide or narrow was that. So in this case I'd say it's pretty wide, so about a little over an octave. Versus maybe a narrower range, which might be more like this. Maybe that was the whole melody of a verse, for example. It would be relatively narrow, and you could hear that in the song itself. Next gets us to talking about a very important parameter, which is contour. Contour basically means shape, so if you see me tracing a shape of contour up and down with my arm like this, sort of a waveform, that's sort of the idea behind contour, tracing when the melody goes up or down, mostly ascending or descending. So when you're listening to the contour in a verse or a chorus, etc., you want to see, is it mostly ascending? Is it mostly descending? Is it more bell-shaped, like going up and then coming back down usually? Does it zigzag, like keep going up and down like that? Or does it remain fairly static? So for example, a lot of rap verses might remain right around the same pitch level and only like taper off and go a little lower at the end of a phrase, for example. So when we trace the contour, something to listen out for in our songs is for the peaks and valleys of the melody, especially the peaks. Now, whenever we hear a melodic peak in something like a chorus or even a verse, that peak is going to be significant. It catches our attention and draws our ear towards that note, that lyric, that part of the phrase. So, for example, if you think of the melody, somewhere over the rainbow, we hear there a peak on the word where in somewhere. Somewhere, the highest point in that phrase. And that is going to draw some attention to that particular lyric, somewhere over the rainbow. It gives it a little bit more of a wistful sound and draws attention to that first word, somewhere. The valley, by contrast, tends to be coming to a point of rest. So if you have a melody that's sort of floating down like a leaf on the wind, da, 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 maybe it comes down to a point of rest like that, and the lowest point feels like it's the most settled, the most resolved. And that brings us to our next term, which is the cadence. Cadence describes not rhythm, which you might be expecting, but really how the melody comes to a close. Does it come to a close as being open-ended or sounding resolved? So to use my earlier example, an open-ended cadence might sound like da 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 da. And if it ends out on that note of da da, we can kind of hear it wanting to go down, da da, but it just doesn't quite get there before the phrase is over, and so it leaves some work to be done. Whereas if it had resolved, da 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 da, that gives it more closure and it's fully resolved. And finally, we should talk some about the motive, which is a recognizable, repeating part of the melody. It's what helps our ear to hone in on certain musical ideas. For example, in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you have dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. So that dun 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 dun, that becomes a recognizable part of the melody that we listen out for in the rest of the piece. Another example is Star Wars. Dun bum ba da 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 bum. So when you hear that da dum, that would be an opening motive for that melody. Sometimes you'll hear this called the hook because it's the part that kind of gets stuck in your ear and that you remember from the melody. Now, when we start talking about motives, it allows us to talk about melodic segmentation. Now, that's sort of a fancy word to just basically mean where does the melodic motive repeat and how does that structure the phrase. So the way this works is that generally we can divide a melodic phrase that we hear into 4 equal parts, and then we can label them as X, Y, and Z. What we're looking out for is where is there a repeat in the melodic phrase, and there we can put another time of X. That all sounds kind of abstract, but I think you'll see how it works. So for some examples, if we have X, Y, X, Z, that means the repeat of the motive is in the first half and in the second half, that third segment, but it ends in a different way. So for example, if you had, I put an apple on my head, I put an apple in my bed. There you would hear sort of, I put an apple as the X that repeats, but there's something that changes on the second part of each of those. You might have XX, YZ, that is repeating the motive immediately. So hearing that recognizable idea that sort of repeats right away, but then ends in a different way. So an example would be E.T.'s flying theme. Dum bum da 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 dum bum. bum bum ba da 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 dum bum. So you get that motive of da 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 dum bum. Repeat it again, and then it does something else to end. X, Y, Z, Y, this is called musical rhyming, where the end part is actually the same, but each half of the phrase starts a little bit differently. So it's the second half that repeats. And then there's X, Y prime. Prime is what we say when we have that little apostrophe, which means something's a little bit different. So basically that means we have the same phrase twice, but it ends differently the second time. Maybe open-ended the first time and resolved the second. XXYX, this one is very common in folk songs as well as British rock. If you think of the song Old MacDonald Had a Farm, you have Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, then and on that farm he had a done, E-I-E-I-O. So X repeat again, then you get something different with a dun 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 dun, all that stuff. Then it comes back to Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. So XXY back to X at the end. Then a common one for pop and EDM as well as hip hop, especially in the chorus, is XXXY. So repeating the same idea 3 times and then doing something different at the end. Alright, and then 2 more at the end. These are less common, but you might hear XYZX, so the motive repeating at the end of the phrase, kind of creating a sandwich effect. Or you might hear XYZW, just everything is different and no repeat of the main melodic motive at all. So those are less common, but you might run into them as well. So listen out for where the melodic motive might repeat and how that helps to structure the phrase according to these ones that you see here.